Hi, welcome to our third module, and the title of our third module is the Behavioral Theory of Learning. Again, this is Dr. Rogers Noguera. For this module, for this session, we have four basic learning outcomes. First, um, first we intend to understand the basic concepts and processes of behavioral theory of learning. The second is to identify the application of behavioral theory in classroom setting. And the third is to apply the theory in classroom situations. And the fourth is to understand and solve the case of Zainab. Remember our case. To give you a summary, a brief summary of the whole module, it is about this, this context. Remember, no behavior, no learning. The only evidence for learning is behavior. And what is behavior? Behavior is a person's external response to stimulus. This is internal, this is external. I'm going to elaborate on these later on. Another basic premise of the behavioral theory of learning is that we cannot observe what is inside our mind. For example, this one, let's fix a mathematical equation or the creativity. What we can only observe is behavior. Okay. To make this more concrete, so which is more observable here? What's happening here in the mind, or what we can actually externalize? For example, using the abacus for counting, in terms of mathematics, learning mathematics, or in terms of learning arts, it's about doing sculpture, right? So it has to be very, very observable. Let us now explore the most basic principles of behavioral theory of learning. The learners are given rapid feedback, quick feedback concerning the accuracy of their learning, and it is shown immediately after a learning experience whether there is a correct or not correct response. An example of this, for example, you ask the students to work on a specific project, then you observe what they're doing, then you will say, okay, you're doing good, good job. You're doing what is right, you're doing the right thing, you're on the right path. On the other hand, also, if the students are not able to catch up with that, what they're supposed to do, then you can always say, nice try, this is the best way to do it. Okay, you have done something great already, but this is still, you still have to do this one and that one. Okay, this is the feedback should be immediate. The feedback should be very, very concrete, very, very real, and to the point. And learners are able to learn at their own pace, at their own time. A teacher requires a learning environment that allows for individual differences in learning rate. So similar to biological theory, um, behavior theory is also embraces the individual differences. Individual differences in terms of they handle time, how they look at things. There should be a reason why students are very actively engaged. There are some reasons why students are kind of slow in responding, because precisely there are stimulus that drives each of the students, and that we have to understand. Okay, so the question is, Do you think children will learn at the same time? The behaviors will tell you. So one of the things that we will be doing when we become a teacher is to write a learning objective when we do lesson planning. So learning objective should be completely specified. It should be very, very specific, very, very clear before teaching begins. So you have to clarify, what do I want to achieve in the class? Okay. Objectives should be written, should be defined behaviorally. Take note, it should be behavioral. Identify to what extent the objectives had been met. It should be measurable. Take note, it should be measurable behaviorally. We look at the behaviors as the outcome. We look at the behaviors as the outcome of learning. So let's have an example of this. At the end, this is an example on how to write a learning outcome behaviorally. At the end of the lesson, the student should be able to, just for example, kick the ball or read a book. What do you call this? Be able to cook. Okay, so many other examples. So as you observe, it has to have a very, very clear goal. It has to have very, very clear of behavioral objective. What exact behavior do I want to see? Do I want to observe? All right. Let us have some example here. Regardless of the subjects that you're going to teach, science, math, English, Arabic, Islamic, right? This is an example of behavioral learning outcome. So at the end of the addition lesson, grade 1 students should be able to count money whenever they buy things in the stores. It's very, very clear. So at the end of the lesson, the student should be able to count, okay, to make use of the addition processes whenever they buy something, for example, in the cold store. Now, as an exercise, you will have to do this sometime later. Write a behavioral learning outcome for grade 1 students on any lesson from any subjects, from English, math, science, Arabic, and Islamic. Choose 2 subjects. You can choose English or math, or you can choose Arabic or Islamic, or let's say science or English, and write learning outcome for each. 1 learning outcome, for example, for English, and 1 learning outcome for math. Okay, let's continue. Okay, remember, in terms of behavioral theory, motivation is simply a reinforcer of a behavior. What do you mean by reinforcer? Something that pushes, something that strengthens a specific behavior. Okay, just for example, so you would like to strengthen the behavior in terms of playing a football. So you're giving kind of motivation in terms of reward system. So in terms of, let's say, an affirmation. So your reward, your affirmation, or let's say what you call an activity that you give for the student should reinforce this specific behavior. Again, motivation, such as reward, okay, should strengthen a specific behavior, existing behaviors, as for example, playing football. Now, the next is the emphasize extrinsic reinforcer over intrinsic reinforcer. What are the examples of extrinsic reinforcer? We have lots of examples that we use in the class, and for example, the smiley, the saying the good job, very good, excellent work, or giving some candies, giving what they call these, some rewards. Those are an example of extrinsic reinforcer. So what do we mean by intrinsic reinforcer? So I would like you to browse your internet and look what's the meaning. Look for the examples of intrinsic reinforcer so that you will know the difference between extrinsic reinforcer and intrinsic reinforcer. Okay. The next is in the early stage of learning, correct response is reinforced each time it occurs. Later on, reinforce periodically to make the response resistant to extinction. So to make it simple, remember when you were still driving, doing the driving lesson. So at first, your driver will be telling you what you're supposed to do, will be telling you you're right, you're doing the right thing, or you're doing the wrong thing. Okay, so you're very much dependent. So you're very much dependent to your instructor as a learner in driving. But later on, as the instructor, driving instructor, observe that you're kind of good already, then he will just slowly allow you to be without interrupting. So the goal is that from from being a dependent learner, you lead the children to become independent learner. So the children will be able to solve things on her own, do activities on her own. Okay. Okay. Good. In behavioral theory, teacher would avoid the lecture technique because she would not know when the learning is taking place. As for example, with this one, very often we ask the question, "Do you understand?" And the student would say, "Yes, we understand." But how exactly would you know what is really happening inside the head of these students? We would not know, except for saying, "Yes, we understand," or they're nodding their head. But it is possible that they really do not understand at all. So, so what behavioral theory is teaching us is the only evidence to understand that there's really understanding that happened in the teaching process is behavior. Okay, so show a behavioral processes. Just for example, understanding can happen. For example, if the students is able to read two books, for example, you're teaching language. So if the students are able to finish, let's say one storybook, or if the students are able to locate the let's say Bahrain in on this map on this globe. So these are very specific external behavioral evidence of learning. Avoid giving punishment. So take note of that. Avoid giving punishment. Teachers should reinforce or strengthen appropriate or positive behavior and ignore inappropriate behavior. Okay. So again, reinforce appropriate behavior. So the students you um, are, for example, are very good in solving things, or very good in on a specific behavior, or very kind towards the other students, or reinforce that and make use of that and make use of that positive behavior to overpower the negative behavior. So as you look at this, so it's always about looking at the positive things, looking at the positive behavior of a child. The next thing is that teacher will design well the learning environment. Okay, design well the learning environment, the learning materials, and the classroom design to experience the maximum success of the teaching and learning processes. Now, as a teacher, how will you design your classroom and learning materials to reinforce, to strengthen positive behavior? So go back to your experiences in your teaching practice. So, um, what are those classroom that really reinforce positive behavior? What are those materials that make students inactive in the class or not really engaging at all? So what are those activities? What are those learning materials that make children more engaging, more uh, positively participating in the class? The information to be learned is presented in small steps. Start with simple and proceed with the complex. Okay, so um, so that what you really have to plan, you really have to understand where the students are. So you'll have to start with easy, going to difficult task. All right. Okay, take note of these. Problems in learning are the result of one, poor educational planning. Number two, teachers fail, okay, to provide self-pacing. You know what is self-pacing? Is be able to understand where the students are, whether the students are fast or slow. There's no really problem at all. If the students are quite slow in doing things, just that's the way it is. Okay. You don't have to say to the students you are so slow, you're wrong. There's nothing wrong being slow. This is the way the student respond to the stimulus. Use reinforcer appropriately. Offer materials in chunks. You know, these chunks, little by little, shui shui. Use discipline to control behavior. Use discipline to control positive behavior, or to lead to positive behavior, rather. And number three, rigid. You know what is rigid? It's just so you don't have room for flexibility. So you have to be very, very flexible, or making unreasonable demands that build fear, anxiety. So avoid making things that will build fear and anxiety on children. Okay, it's like overloading of activities that there's not enough to really understand whether there is a positive behavior happening in terms of learning. Okay, as you see here, it has to be always centered on on what the child would bring out in terms of the positive behavior. So all that you will be doing as a teacher should lead to positive behavior. So you have to avoid all this anxiety and fear. And even if the students would have difficulty, then find a way to focus on creating a positive behavior rather than creating anxiety and fear on children. Students should know that they are learning, and teachers should know that they are teaching. So as a teacher, how would you know that they are teaching, and how would the students know that they are learning? And the answer for that is very, very simple. Look at the positive behavior of children. Then it means if there's a positive behavior, you are doing the right thing in terms of teaching, and they're also doing the right thing in terms of learning, because there is a positive behavior, the positive behavioral learning outcome. So look at the frequency. Frequency is the number, when things are repeated at a certain, but those are the frequency. The frequency, the numbers of behaviors. How many times should a student repeat a behavior to make a learning permanent? So the task, the challenge is always, how can I make an appropriate behavior permanent, or how will I what will I do so that the student will keep on repeating and repeating the same appropriate behavior. Just for example, if you're teaching mathematics, how many times should I teach this equation so that the learning will become the mathematical learning will become permanent to the child. For example, learning abacus, how many times should students do a specific task so that the subtraction, the addition, or the multiplication using the abacus become permanent in uh, in the behavior of students. Just for example, in terms of learning how to ride a bike, how many lessons does a child need to master? Need to master. Uh, how many lessons does a child need to master a behavior? So how many lessons does a child need to master the biking? Okay, to fully learn the cycling. There are different ways of introducing a new learning behavior to students. Modeling, learning from observing and copying behavior, rehearsal, role play, practice, and repetition of behavior. Facilitation, performing a behavior at a more appropriate times and ways and with people. And coding, organizing a structure to understand a behavior. As for example, so this is an example of imitation and modeling. For example, how did you learn how to pray? How did you learn how to read Quran? So basically, it's about repetition and modeling. And as a teacher, we have to create a very very concrete, a very clear structure again, so that whatever goal we have in terms of a specific appropriate or positive behavior, um, so make sure it's very very clear so that we can really achieve what we want. Okay. We condition. What is the other word for condition? We program behaviors. Okay. Why? We program or we condition behaviors so that positive behavior will occur again. Okay. And if there's a negative behavior, we program behavior so that we can eliminate the negative behavior and replace it with positive behavior. So you have to remember that if you want to change a negative behavior, so you have to replace that with positive behavior. So remember our definition at the beginning. So behaviors are conditioned by stimulus. Behaviors are programmed by stimulus. If we want to change the behavior, change the stimulus. But if we want to sustain a behavior, you know what is sustain? Is to make it more permanent. Okay, you have to strengthen the stimulus. But how? So let us learn the ABC of behavior. A stands for antecedent. B stands for behavior. C stands for consequence. Antecedent is basically the conditioned stimulus to predict an expected learning behavior. That's why we call it antecedents. It's a stimulus before a behavior, and the consequence is it reinforces the sustained expected learning behavior. So it means the stimulus or reinforcer after this behavior. Okay, again, the behavior is the expected learning behavior. So our expected learning behavior is basically influenced by stimulus happening in the antecedent and the stimulus happening in the consequence. So both antecedent and consequent influence this behavior. So you have to, for your information, you have to remember that the behaviors make use of animals to experiment on the behavior. I mean, just open the YouTube and you'll be able to find so many experiments done on animals in terms of training them, in terms of programming their behavior. Okay, so for the animal to respond on a specific way, you have to condition the antecedent and you have to condition also the consequences. Okay, I will not elaborate on that anymore. Just open the YouTube and you'll be able to find lots of examples. All right, specifically on training animals. Basically, they are using the behavioral theory. Okay, let's look at this. Let's go back to this one. Learning, for example, this is what we would like to work on. Learning fasts. Learning how to ride a bicycle fasts. So what are the conditions that reinforces the learning fast? Look at the antecedents. Look at what's happening before. So what is reinforcing this one is the antecedent, which is having the supportive and affirming father. Okay, when you're saying, okay, you're doing good, you're doing the right thing. Okay, and we have this one also, and after the behavior, the father is giving reward to his son. Okay, and the other one also is that the the child is creating pleasure in riding a bike. So it means that, and on the other hand, also part of the antecedents, also part of the consequences. For example, the child is dreaming to become a professional. What do you call this? Uh, Professional biker. Okay. Okay, and that also reinforces the learning fast because something is running in the head of the child in terms of his dream. Okay, and that makes it more pleasurable also for him. The next one is the other side. What makes the biking the learning of biking slow? So again, look at the antecedent and look at the consequence. Example, the antecedents is a father is very, very strict, very, very demanding, he's always shouting. Okay, for example, stupid, you're very slow. And afterwards, the antecedent after, for example, doing the training, the father will punish the child, his son, and will shaming. And the other thing also, some friends might be watching him during the training, and afterwards they bully the child. So that creates also the antecedent of not wanting to learn anymore. So the next time around, for sure, you will expect a learning slow because of these conditions, the A and C conditions. On the other hand, also, for example, the child does not really want to to learn how to bike. What he really wants is she wanted to learn to play football. This is his interests. Okay, so if the interest is football, so the antecedent and consequence would not help. Okay, would only what they call this reinforce this learning slow. Okay. This theory is not only for learning in our day-to-day choices in life. You'll make use of behavior theory of learning. Just for example, um, you are into football and you want to buy football shoes. So for in buying a football shoes, you have some antecedents in your choice. Okay, for example, your antecedent is Ronaldo. Okay, one of the best players of football. So if Ronaldo is endorsing a specific one, so your antecedent for buying a shoes will be him. So the behavior of this is definitely you will buy the shoes of Ronaldo, and the consequence of that is so When people see you wearing the shoes of Ronaldo, they will be offended, wow, you're very good, you're like Ronaldo, so on and so forth. So this one and this one in the future will always be a good reinforcer in your choices. So you have a good you have a very strong reinforcer here, and you also have a very strong reinforcer here. That's why in classroom also, that's why we're making use of the what do you call this? The starter activities. That is an antecedents to the expected behavior outcome that we wish to happen inside the classroom, and the rewards that we're giving to the children also, that becomes also the antecedent to reinforce a specific behavior. Okay, now let us now try to understand this. You will find some children who are into this situation. I do not want to do the activity. Let us now try to understand what what is the possible antecedent why a child would not want to do an activity, and what also are the possible consequences that reinforce this kind of behavior in the classroom. So our intention is not only to understand what is happening here and what's happening here, we also want to change this behavior. So what could be a good antecedent? So we have to change this antecedent, and we have to change the antecedents to come up with a positive behavior. So what are the possible antecedents to change this behavior? What are the positive consequence or for this positive reinforcer here that will also change this behavior? Okay, so you will have to answer that. Okay, let's look into the aspect of bully. So using the behavioral theory, the ABC, let us understand what's happening in the antecedents that leads a child to bully, and let's also try to understand what's happening in the consequence that reinforce the behavior of child to bully. But again, our task here is not only to understand why the child is that why a child bullies. We also want to change this bullying behavior. So what can we do to change this one, and what can we do to change this one to change this behavior? Again, we have to change this one. We also have to change this one to change this behavior. Find it out. Okay. Okay. Again, it's like go back to your experiences in teaching practice. So identify those students who are really very much engaging. Those students are kind of slow. So now try to create some kind of hypothetical, okay, understanding on how things work. What could be an antecedent why this child is very engaging, very fast in terms of learning? What could be the consequences of that? And how are you going to strengthen this behavior? What could be the possible antecedents to strengthen this one? And what could be the possible consequences to strengthen this one? So this child is getting slow. Okay, what could be the antecedent why the child is slow? What could be the reason for that? And what could be the consequences why the child is slow? And now, again, we don't only want to understand, we also want to change. So how you're going to change this is slow learner. So what are the possible antecedents that you're going to change so that you will help this one? So what are the possible consequences that you're going to introduce, new consequence that you're going to introduce so that you will be able to change this slow learning thing? Okay. And last but not the least, remember the case of Zainab. Okay. So what are the possible antecedents that led to this behavior? And what are the possible consequences that led to this behavior? And now as a teacher, you would like to help Zainab. You would like to bring her back to her positive behavior. So what possible antecedents can I create to change the behavior? And what possible consequences can I do? Can we develop to change um, to change this behavior. Okay, I will be asking that a little later as an exercise for the class. And let us reflect in view of behavioral perspective as teachers. How should we plan the teaching, learning, and assessment processes in our classrooms? Just for example, when we're talking about assessment, and most of our assessment are what do you call this, very objective. It's like the an example of that is the multiple choice. And when multiple choice, the objective test. So if you give this kind of test to children, speaking of the behavioral theory, they think there is a real learning happening there. Are we really assessing the learning of children when we are using this kind of assessment? And to end this and to sum up everything, the evidence of effective teaching, learning, and assessment is positive behavior. Again, the evidence of effective teaching, learning, and assessment is positive behavior. So for this session, um, what I would like you to do is just to pick up two important learnings that you had for this session. Just two important learning, just two short lines about what you learned about what you learned in this session in our module behavioral theory of learning. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. Bye.